Welcome to Forum 2029. Welcome back those who came to our last live Forum 2029, which was about a month ago now. That was the launch. This is a series that started in June, is running till September, but then after that will run until 2029. The premise of the series is basically building through a wide consultation, including yourselves tonight, a living standards policy program that is fit for purpose, which is an alternative to the existing direction of the UK government, which partly why we're all probably here is because we agree it's not the right direction. And kind of splitting that policy program into a number of different pillars. So we started with housing, we moved on to food, water, energy. The last one was 2 weeks ago, and that was public services. So for that we brought in Jeremy Driscoll, Abhi Jitendra from JRF, and Anna Koop from the New Economics Foundation. So we're kind of canvassing opinion from across both the third sector, charities, NGOs, and so on, MPs from the Greens, from Labour, independents, and also various other expertise, for example, today from the TUC, from academia, and so on. So today's forum is a little bit different, actually, but I think is particularly relevant. And those of us who helped organize this series, Jeremy is one of them, thought it was really important to have media, tech, and democratic reform as part of a conversation around living standards. Because as much as we can have a bunch of ideas around how to make public services better, how to make work better, how to make kind of welfare better, none of that's really going to cut through unless we have proper democratic reform, proper media reform. As we all know, the UK is one of the standout countries for its particularly cartelled news media environment, and that's always been an obstacle to any kind of progressive change. So very much part of the living standards conversation, as we see it, is really about kind of unblocking these obstacles. Of course, reform, policy ideas, and so on, none of that by itself can change this country. We need to build power, we need to build organizing forces, and so on. But nonetheless, we do need to have a vision about what that reform looks like, what that vision is. And today we're talking about media, tech, and democratic reform. So we're trying to pack quite a lot in to a small session. The purpose of these sessions is not just to have a good discussion, it's also to try and distill some concrete ideas for what that reform would look like. So we are going to push each of our speakers to have one or two key policies, which by themselves won't just be silver bullets, of course, but as part of a raft of policies would actually be the kind of vision that we need for a platform fit for purpose. Yes, and so that's going to be written up at the end of this series in September. There'll be another live event here on September 16th, 17th. There's all the information's on our website. That's going to be a live macrodose episode with a bunch of really good speakers. So I do welcome you to come to that again. The series is actually ending or pausing now, and we have a summer kind of recess, and then we're going to come back in September for 3 consecutive weeks in a row. So the first week, second week, and third week of September will be the final series. So the first 2 will be remote. The last one, as I say, will be here. So hopefully you can come back. Hopefully it won't be so goddamn hot as well. It's really hot. Although I think there's two new fans coming. So thanks for that, Annie. Thanks for having us at Oxford House. My name is Will Strong. I'm the Chief Exec of the Autonomy Institute. If you've heard of us before, you know what we're all about. But for those that haven't heard of us, we do 3 things, roughly. We do policy and advocacy around work, welfare, climate, and technology, as well as democracy and transparency, too. We run experiments. We run experiments around the 4-day week, around basic income, workplace changes at shop floor level. And then we do a bunch of, kind of, I guess, broadly intelligence-based work. So that's looking at political donations, government contracts. We're doing a project right now with the ITUC around the connections between large corporates and far-right actors worldwide, focusing on the UK and Hungary to begin with. So a bunch of different stuff. But this is very much in our wheelhouse, living standards policy. We are the home of the UBS hub, Universal Basic Services, the basic income conversation, and so on and so forth. So hopefully we're well placed to deliver this. And the write-up, as I say, will be published in September, October sometime. I had this quote from a book, Lawrence Grossberg, someone I've come across recently, a cultural theorist in America, who had this kind of way of thinking about the current conjuncture. And I think conjunctural analysis, strategic conjunctural analysis is really, really important. And I think it sums up nicely kind of what perhaps, hopefully, we're going to be talking about today at a very high level, I guess, which is the past we want to overcome, the present we inhabit, and the futures we anticipate. So with that said, we're going to move on to our first speaker. I'll introduce each speaker as we go. Professor Jeremy Gilbert is Professor of Cultural and Political Theory at the University of East London. He's the author of many books, most recently Hegemony Now with Alex Williams. He's written widely for decades on aesthetics, music, political economy. His recent paper came out on techno-feudalism versus different regimes of accumulation and capital. And today he's going to be talking about media reform, most broadly, although I'm not entirely sure what he's going to be talking about in its specifics, so we'll have to see. Each speaker has about 10 minutes. As I say, they're going to end on at least a couple of specific concrete policy recommendations. We'll see how specific they get. And yes, the three topics, media, democracy, and tech, are all going to be covered in some form. We'll then welcome questions and discussion afterwards. I hope that's clear. I hope I haven't spoken too deliriously with my slightly under the weather format. I'll pass on to Jeremy. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Will. Thanks everyone for being here. I'm going to stall a bit because I've got a message from Hilary Wainwright saying she's on her way. She's always late. All right, so I think the first thing to say is to reiterate the point that Will made, that we're not going to achieve the thing that a lot of us are primarily concerned about, and a raise in people's living standards, a transfer of wealth from the rich to the poor, without something like functional political democracy. Now, if you're sitting there thinking, well, actually, don't we really get outcomes of that nature because of changes in the balance of class forces? Don't we really need the organised working class? The answer is yes, we do need that. But historically, if you look at what are the historical conditions for effective reform, for real changes in distributions of power and wealth, there's always a complex relationship between things like workers' organisation, political organisation, and the actual institutions that you have. And what is very clear from the past few hundred years of history is if you have totally non-functioning democratic institutions, then you cannot expect to get any kind of meaningful reform. And there's no question that the democratic institutions in this country are particularly dysfunctional. Now, we could have a whole different talk about why, in fact, to some extent, liberal representative democracy is just broken absolutely everywhere. In a nutshell, I would say, and I have said in thousands of nutshells before, if you want to read about it at length, basically, look, when you have a society as complicated as an advanced capitalist society today, you need some much more robust and participatory form of democracy if you actually want democratic outcomes. People were predicting that from the 60s, and they were right. And now we have a situation where the party political representative system really doesn't work very well anywhere. But things are particularly bad in Britain. Why are things particularly bad in Britain? Because we have this situation where, firstly, as I'm sure most of us here know, we have this ridiculous first past the post electoral system, which is only designed to be even vaguely functional in a purely two-party system. In a system like ours, you end up with a situation whereby the only people who actually decide the outcomes of elections are people who live in marginal constituencies, and it's only the people who live in those constituencies who actually change their votes, which most people don't. Most people don't change their vote. Most people vote the way their parents did, or the way their ideological convictions persuade them to vote, and therefore, by definition almost, the kind of person who changes their vote a lot tends to be a particular kind of person who's not that well informed about politics, thinks very short term, and doesn't have a lot of information. So we've already handed over electoral outcomes to that bunch of people with the system that we have now. The statistic that was given in, I think it was the 2010 election, was that the entire election was decided by 50,000 people in 2015, which is about right. We also have a situation where, as we all know, we have an extremely right-wing, even compared to places like the States, an extremely biased sort of media system and media ecology. Where I think this becomes really pernicious is when you think about the way in which these things mesh together. You have a situation where you have the legacy of 120 years of fascism from the Daily Mail. Then you have the Daily Mail having one of the biggest websites in the country. Then you have Nigel Farage, who is a kind of avatar of the Daily Mail ideology, becoming the biggest politician on TikTok. And you get this cycle of reinforcement of views. And most people in Britain look at Nigel Farage and think he's just an idiot. Most people in Britain don't believe what the Daily Mail tells them. But who are the kind of people who believe what the Daily Mail tells them, who look at Nigel Farage on TikTok and believe him? They're exactly the kind of people who fit into that set of 50-odd thousand people who live in marginal constituencies and can be persuaded easily to change their votes. So we end up with a system where the entire sort of ecology, the entire assemblage, if you like, of the electoral system and the media ecology is biased towards extremely conservative, essentially pro-capitalist viewpoints. Normally, historically, this benefits the Conservatives, but a particular historical moment, it might benefit the Labour Party, it might benefit other parties, but it always benefits somebody who is promoting a political agenda which essentially appeals to conservative, low information, transactional, short-term thinking voters and tends to push the political spectrum to the right. So I think you really have to think about the entire kind of system of the media ecology, the dysfunctional constitution, as a completely broken system that really has to be addressed systematically if you're going to have anything like democratic outcomes. Does that make sense? All right. So, sorry? I can just put it close to my mouth. It was feeding back a little bit, so I didn't want to talk too loud. So that's point one, okay? That's my first point, done in 5 minutes. Very pleased with myself there. Point two, which is relevant to thinking about things today. Let's come back to this question I kind of raised right at the start, the question not just of institutions, but of class power. Who are the social classes? Who are the fractions of classes in the world who have the most power today? Well, I would say one of the things, the very important things to understand about living in the world today is there is a particular group of people, a section, if you like, of the global capitalist class that has a really extraordinary and in some ways globally unprecedented kind of power, and that's the American tech industry. That's the American tech platform industry. That's a particular problem for a country like Britain, because not only do you have this bunch of capitalists somewhere that are extremely powerful, that governments are terrified of, they're not even within our jurisdiction anyway. And having left the European Union, we've exited the only political institution which has historically had any success at disciplining that industry at all. But historically, the European Union has had some success of forcing the tech industry to regulate itself and to pay its taxes, more than the federal government and the states ever have. But we're out of there now. So we're completely exposed. And you can see it's very clear from their behavior that our own political class is completely terrified of and completely subservient to this American tech class. I think ultimately, the only solution to that would be something like a state-supported like tech industry, a media industry in this country. Now, what would be solutions to all this? I mean, Natalie is going to talk more than I am about policy solutions, like what it would mean to actually have a democratic media. I think, obviously, historically, there are all kinds of things government can do. Government can regulate private media, and I think we should have comprehensive regulation of private media. I think anything like a newspaper should have to be owned by a trust of some kind. It just shouldn't be legal for like a guy to own something like that. It's perfectly possible to make that not legal. And government could be supporting independent media, democratic media, and it could be using the public media to countervail the power of private and corporate media much more than it does. But I really think more fundamentally, though, I think the thing that I think we really need, and that we need any kind of political leadership to do in the foreseeable future, is to recognize the extent to which there's a fundamental breakdown in the functioning of democracy in this country, really since the 1970s. Now, this is a point, I know some people here would have heard me make this point 100 times before, but I will never tire of making it. You look at opinion polls going right back to the mid-1980s. The core programme which government has engaged in, whether Labour government or Tory governments, is the mid-80s. The programme of privatisation of public utilities, redistribution of wealth and resources from the poor to the rich, has not had public support. People haven't supported it. Most people have actually voted for parties that were opposed to it, but the electoral system delivered majorities in favour of it anyway. I would say during the New Labour years, most people were voting Labour not because they wanted a continuation of that programme, but because they wanted some kind of break with it. They didn't get it. really the entire trajectory of government since the 1970s has not had a popular mandate. And it's not a surprise that we've ended up in a situation in which distributions of resources are now so unequal and so unfair. It's not a surprise that people like Nigel Farage are so popular, because they have a narrative that tells people, that takes account of all that. They say to people, look, we know you feel like everything's been going wrong for decades for now, and we've got a story about why that's happened. It's because of the immigrants in the European Union. If we're not willing to tell an equally robust and long-term story to people, then we're not going to convince them not to go with the Farages. Which is why what we really need is political leadership, which is willing to stand up and say, look, we accept this has been fucked for like 40 years now. And we need a fundamental rethink about what democracy means in this country. I remember at one point during the Corbyn leadership, I was on bended knees to James Schneider. So can you not get Jeremy to say this? Even Jeremy, no, you wouldn't say it. Because in the end, even Jeremy Corbyn, for all of his radicalism, wouldn't accept this analysis. That it's not just we've had the wrong parties or the wrong leadership in power since the 70s. We've had a system which fundamentally doesn't work and requires some kind of fundamental reform. And until the day we have a leadership that is willing to make that point to people, because people know it in their bones to be true, then we will not have credible leadership or a credible alternative to the far right. That's it.
Thanks, Jeremy. Okay, our next speaker is Professor Natalie Fenton, who's Professor of Media and Communications at Goldsmiths University. Her latest book, Democratic Illusions, How the Media Hollows Out Democracy and What We Can Do About It. Natalie, I won't dally anymore.
Thank you. And I'm going to, that sounds really loud to me. I'm going to build a bit on what James just said, but I'm going to take as given the notion that democracy is failing and move on from that. And I think we have, in research in the field, we've got a well-documented history of the ways in which media and tech systems have failed democracy and have contributed to its demise. We've got a history of distortions, misrepresentations, illegal practices, and evidence of lack of accountability in our mainstream media and tech over very many years. Yet still, they all peddle the myth that they are crucial to a functioning, healthy democracy. They will endlessly speak of how they are the handmaidens of free speech, and it's them that need to be supported and thrive. But of course, free speech in these instances may mean things like invasion of people's privacy for salacious stories designed solely for clickbait, like we had, if you think back to the hacking scandal, still not resolved. It might mean the bankrolling of and publicity for favoured electoral candidates. And of course, famously, Musk donated in the region of $132 million to Trump and other Republicans in the run-up to the 2024 US election. He then served as a promoter and policy advisor to Trump campaign and effectively turned X into a MAGA mouthpiece. And we shouldn't forget either that in that process, immediately after the election, Apple, Meta, Google, Amazon, all donated $1 million to Trump's inauguration fund. Or free speech might mean opening up a platform to fascists and white supremacists, as Musk did when he took over X, restoring 62,000 suspended accounts, many of which belonged to neo-Nazis and white nationalists, accused of spreading hate speech and conspiracy theories. Crucially, of course, he also reversed the ban on Trump's account, which was put in place after the attack on US Capitol in 21. Musk then was appointed, and all this is relevant because I think all this is relevant to the UK. Musk was then appointed head of the Department of Government Efficiency, an entirely unaccountable body outside of government, but hugely influential. Of course, we know that bromance eventually blew up, but before he left, there was an estimated 200 60,000 federal workers who had been fired through that leadership. When he left Doge, his wealth did suffer a very small loss. He lost $2.1 billion, only 0.5% of his wealth. But he had gained a massive turbocharging of his wealth since supporting Trump of $170 billion in that period. Now, if that all sounds like it couldn't possibly happen here, that's the US. Well, be warned that foreign billionaires can indeed donate to British politics via UK shell companies or shadowy groups called unincorporated associations. And UK politics has received £700,000 in 2025 alone through those means. Peter Gogan's site on Democracy for Sale is a brilliant place to go to for more detail on that. 19 days after Labour's landslide victory, Keir Starmer met with Demis Hassabis, the CEO of Google DeepMind. He agreed to act as a sense check for all AI regulation. And in January 25, he was appointed in a formal advisory role for AI legislation. Of course, since then, Starmer has declared that AI will turbocharge Britain's economy, and I know that others on the panel are going to talk about that. In the first 6 months of this government, Labour ministers and senior civil servants met with tech industry execs and lobbyists 6 times per week. That's 161 meetings in 6 months. And this week, this may or may not be related, but this week we also heard that the BBC is considering the outsourcing of its recommendation algorithms, which direct users to content, to big tech. And once again, we get that flicker of possibility that it will be publicly funded institutions giving its resources for the benefit of private corporations. Now, much of this kind of simply boils down to power and wealth corrupting democracy, and therefore also driving, as Jem said, massive and increasing inequalities. We shouldn't forget that these tech leaders are the richest people in the world. I won't go through how rich they are, but they're fucking rich. Meanwhile, recently, the Equality Trust recently released data showing that the 50 richest families in the UK now earn more than the poorest half of the entire UK population. That's more than 34 million people. The Good Things Foundation have noted that in the UK, 8.5 million people lack the necessary skills to get online, and 2.4 million people can't afford a mobile phone contract or an internet connection. The vast majority of our mainstream media and tech systems are not concerned with democratic good. They're simply chasing money and power. And now it's easy to focus on big tech. In some ways, they're very easy hits. But we shouldn't forget about our legacy media either. In the UK, 3 companies, DMG Media, that's the Daily Mail Group, News UK, that's Murdoch, and Reach, control 90% of national UK newspaper circulation. And that's a 20% increase in the concentration of news ownership since 2014. The same 3 companies account for 40% of the combined reach of UK's top 50 online news brands. And this is research that we've done for the Media Reform Coalition that I'm also part of. UK local newspapers in a dire state. 2 companies now control 51% of our local newspapers, NewsQuest and National World. Now, concentration of ownership limits plurality and it fortifies power in ever fewer hands. It creates fear in politicians that they need to pander to those organisations' needs or suffer electoral defeat. And it also creates fear in journalists of speaking out in case they will lose their jobs or they'll be rendered unemployable. And it may not have escaped your attention that the BBC has recently been embroiled in a debate over an obscure punk rap group from Ipswich at Glastonbury leading a chant against the Israeli Defence Forces a day after an Israeli newspaper exposed that Israeli soldiers and officers had confessed that they'd been ordered to shoot at unarmed Palestinians as they queued for aid. The Daily Mail also criticised the BBC for live streaming the set, while encouraging readers to watch the very same video on its own pages. Meanwhile, in a systematic analysis by the Centre for Media Monitoring, the BBC's coverage of the war on Gaza has been criticised for its language, framing and editorial choices that marginalise Palestinian suffering and amplify Israeli narratives. Now again, many of these examples underline a kind of a simply age-old story of the influence of commercialism and elite networks of power corrupting democratic practice and processes. But they are some miles away from an independent democratic media holding power to account. And that's reflected, I think, as Jeremy said, in the various trust indices for the UK, where mainstream media and politicians come at the very bottom of those. They are no longer trusted, and for very good reason. And they say, if this is the sort of democracy that they claim to be supporting, then do we want it? Why would we vote for it? If this is what you call democracy, stuff it. So we need to radically rethink democracy. We need a transformative democracy that will actually deliver a just society. Where democracy endlessly works, and this is, I think, where a transformative democracy comes into play. What do we mean by that? What I mean is that we need a democracy that endlessly works towards social and political conditions where simple things like everyone gets an equal say, where each person can participate in society and forms of governance freely, where we foster a society where no one person has supreme vested interests at play, and everyone looks after each other's interests and are willing to act collectively for the common good. So we need what we might call a democratic media communications system that would equate to something like a people's media. I've given up on calling it a public service media because that phrase has gone and been hollowed out of all meaning. I want to call it a people's media that is owned by us, accountable to us, and where we all get to play a part in creating them. Now, very quickly, I'm going to end on what that might look like. I've started to talk about this as a media commons, something which actually acts in all of our interests. It would need a more democratic, diverse and independent public service media. The UK's unique model of public service broadcasting has actually been undermined by decades of political interference, commercialisation and debilitating funding cuts. We need radical reforms to transform that old model into a progressive system of which can deliver a based, yes, on universal provision, but also on political independence and democratic public control over funding, governance, and regulation. A people's BBC would become far more devolved, democratic, and participatory. People would help make decisions about how it's run, whether that's electing decision makers to represent them, being part of participatory commissioning, or sitting on a panel to oversee the coverage of controversial issues. What would it mean if we had a People's Assembly investigating how that Gaza documentary should be dealt with and broadcast? We also, I agree with Jem, need a free and open public service internet, something approximating a British digital corporation with a mission to develop public internet infrastructure and new democratically operated digital platforms to provide a non-commercial public interest alternative to counterbalance the power of big tech. Instead, we're seeing the exact opposite shift. We've got a Royal Charter renewal coming up of the BBC, and we're likely to see, and we've heard leaks already from Lisa Nandy, that she's looking into how we can make more money out of the BBC, how it can be more commercially oriented rather than driven towards public service. We need to end the abuses and concentrations of media power, so we need to future-proof frameworks for protecting media plurality and upholding the highest standards in journalism. We don't have that. In fact, the latest announcement that there would be an allowance of 15% of foreign ownership in UK newspapers that was driven by 4 main newspaper groups has taken us in precisely the opposite direction. And we need a new deal for local media. And again, I can go through the details for that, but local media are in a perilous state, and we need to revitalise it, not but just by finding new funding models, but by embracing new ways of supporting public interest journalism. And that might mean a tax on the tech giants that is then put into a fund that is, through an entirely democratic and participatory model, distributed to organisations, local news organisations that are operating democratically for the public interest. In other words, we need a wholesale reimagining of what are democratic media and communication systems that work for a reconceived, transformative and just democracy might be.
Thanks, Natalie. And kind of considering you and Jeremy as a bit of a double act, some nice detail on the policy at the end there. I forgot to push Jeremy on that. Right. So now moving on to democratic reform, although that, of course, we have heard about democratic reform, but strictly, I suppose, thinking more broadly around things like parliamentary reform, things about electoral system reform, and so on. I'm happy to introduce Lena Swedlow, who is the head of campaigns at Compass. Compass, an organisation very much aligned with a bunch of autonomy's priorities as well. Right now, very much leading around nationalisation of water campaign. Really has been flying the flag for new forms of electoral, new electoral systems, new forms of voting, and so on. So I couldn't think of anyone better to have on the panel to talk about that. So thank you.
Thanks, Will, and thanks for having me. And I think I have to start by saying sorry for immediately getting on stage and spilling water everywhere. Sorry, Adam, about that. As Will said, I'm Lena, and I will talk about electoral reform in a second. I first want to say a little bit about how I got into this and hopefully why this is important to people all around the country. I was one of the 16-year-olds that was given a vote in the independence referendum in 2014. And there was a huge campaign to involve 16-year-olds. So they went around schools, they held town halls, and when I got the chance to ask a question, I did. I wasn't a particularly confident kid, but I stood up and asked the question. This was about, whether I was going to be able to afford uni, where my parents' jobs, any of my immigration status, any of those things. So it felt important. And I asked my question, and a politician stood up on the stage, and the mic kind of squeaked back, and he said in response, "Well, you're awfully well informed. Why don't you sit down so we can get along with the rest of the discussion?" And I think obviously I didn't sit down, I ended up here, but I think that experience is so indicative of how so many people engage with politicians, engage with politics, engage with voting, and that was one of the few instances in the UK where voting actually mattered, and most votes counted. And that's how I found Compass, and that's why I think these things are important, because so much about what Jeremy was outlining about the appeal of Nigel Farage and reform is about how people feel excluded and their right to. So just to give a lay of the land with where democracy is in the UK, it's not doing particularly well in anywhere in the world. I think it's fair to say, but here in the UK, as you mentioned, it is visibly malfunctioning. We have a government that came to power after one of the most disproportionate elections. Millions of people's votes didn't count. We had almost as many people taking part as not taking part. Whole regions returned MPs of just one party, and as we learned today, that's supposed to mean you vote a certain way. And entire communities, again and again and again, were told your vote doesn't count, your voice doesn't count. And globally, but here particularly over the last decade, we've seen a full frontal attack on democratic freedom and structures, whether that's attack on trade union organising, some of the things that were mentioned about media, the right to protest is obviously being curtailed. And the tech platforms, which Adam will speak to and was mentioned a bit, have been reshaping how people engage with politics in a way that has only been narrowing debate. And the global far right is exploiting every crack in that system from local environment schemes like low traffic neighbourhoods or culture wars against abortion access. All of these things are being used to destabilise democracy and concentrate power. And at the heart of that crisis, I think, we can talk for a while about that, but there lies something more fundamental, which Jeremy was indicating. A growing number of people no longer believe that the state is capable of delivering the basics of a dignified life. And that's not a conspiracy. They're looking around at schools falling down and shit in the rivers, and that's a logical conclusion. And this just doesn't feel like a healthy democracy. This feels like managed decline. And when you look at the structures of the things that are supposed to be democratic, it's kind of no wonder we're still operating with the political architecture that we had in the Industrial Revolution, pretty much. Local government doesn't really have any power, certainly not any budget. Devolved assemblies are often left battling for scraps. MPs often have second jobs and are subject to lobbying, as you mentioned. And people feel zero sense of accountability. To their credit, I think we have to look at the Labour government's moves on the House of Lords reform that they have floated might happen. But when the best we can hope for is taking peerages away from people whose families made their fortunes off slavery and removing the Church of England, that kind of tells you how low the bar is for the appetite for some of the democratic reform that we need. Fundamentally, this isn't a modern democracy, it's a relic. And to transform it for the public good, we have to be willing to do more than patch the leaks. And I guess my argument for the rest of the time will be, why is that fixing the voting system rather than any of the other obviously important things and structural issues that we need to address? I think it comes down to, if the state doesn't represent our interests, it doesn't represent our interests. It has no reason to. When people know that their vote matters everywhere, they show up. When political parties have to appeal to a broad class of voters, they have to, and across different regions, they have different priorities. When coalitions are the norm, not the exception, consensus around long-term issues like the environment and housing becomes the norm rather than an exception. When parties have to work together, that means longer-term thinking. And look across Europe. It's the countries with PR systems that tend to deliver stronger climate policy, better civil liberties, and more resilient institutions. And this is, I think, the crucial point about the voting system. No policy platform, whether it's on housing, green jobs, civil liberties, or economic justice, is doing a good job right now of surviving the orthodox, centralised, winner-takes-all Westminster two-party machine. That's a machine that's built to control from the centre, it's built to exclude. So all of these reforms matter, but until you can work in a democracy where your interests are represented, they seem like they're flailing behind and banging on the door for access. So I just want to talk for the last bit of my time about why these changes haven't happened and maybe what we can do. Some of the answer is obvious: vested interests. Trying to change the nature of power in the sixth largest economy in the world, in the oldest parliament, is going to be difficult. The current system works just fine for a small number of people, and they're not going to give up power that easily. But I think there's also a deeper cultural problem, where somewhere along the way, we swallowed a certain level of bad, a certain level of lies from the press, a certain level of surveillance and exploitation, a certain level of dysfunction from the government, a certain level of destitution. And we've been consistently told, explicitly and implicitly, that things just being mostly bad is just the price of being a grown-up country. We hear it constantly from this government in this rhetoric of life is hard, we need to make tough decisions, there are no good options. And it's that deep emotional resignation seeps into us as campaigners. And it's some of what I see behind this worry about proportional representation and changing the voting system, letting the far right in. And I think the other thing is, let's be honest, the phrase proportional representation doesn't exactly set pulses raising. It's not urgent, it doesn't feel winnable, it doesn't feel sexy. And we've absorbed this idea that trying to change the system might make it worse. And And yes, Reform UK and Farage are dangerous, but their strength comes from what Jeremy identified. They name what people already know, that the system is broken, and the difference is they just want to smash it entirely, and we'd like to make it work in the public good. So I think I'll finish on the core argument being democratic reform means the state acts in our interests, and without that, it doesn't feel possible and feasible for a lot of the other progressive issues, whether those are environmental, economic, or housing issues, to get addressed, because there's just no incentive for any of the political parties to do that.
Thanks, Lena. Okay, now, not to put too much on your shoulders, Adam, but I guess for our final speaker, we're going to be talking about tech, but tech obviously is unhelpfully broader term. So we've let Adam talk in whatever way. Yeah, that's the question. We let Adam talk and explore this topic in any way that he sees fit. Adam is the head of policy and campaigns at Connected by Data. He's also the lead on an ongoing TUC project around tech, which I'm sure will feed into his discussion here. And he's also one of the co-founders of the Bristol Cable, I understand, which so he knows a lot about independent media, even though that's not his remit tonight. Adam, over to you.
Thank you, Will, and thank you, everyone. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about tech, and as you mentioned, Will, tech is extremely ambiguous and undefined, unhelpfully term and idea. So I'm going to talk about it in particular in the relationship to work, and the connection to the broad kind of like themes that have been brought up earlier today is the connection to work as the means by which most people find a stake within society to earn a living, to become enfranchised, to gain a part of the wealth or the value that we create as a society, and therefore be able to participate fully in democratic terms, not just in the sort of like electoral ballot box terms, but in terms of being able to maintain and sustain oneself, one's family, one's community. So the work that I mostly do at the TUC focuses on AI, because AI is kind of like everywhere, like that's the big conversation at the moment. But I start by saying, a bit like tech, AI is not one thing. Like it's often used as this kind of like catch-all, kind of like marketing term. It has some common functionalities across different types of AI systems, and it is an automation technology. And I think that's the basic, like fundamental way to understand AI. But it is facial recognition technology. It's automated self-driving vehicles. It's automated decision-making systems used by the government to allocate or profile welfare benefit claimants and whether or not they're more likely to commit fraud. It's the algorithmic systems and recommender systems within social media. And of course, it's generative AI, made famous by ChatGPT, but also lots of other applications that do the same thing. And obviously, as an automation technology, and the labor movement understands automation technologies, and that's why I refer it to that, is that for 200 years, the labor movement has been dealing with automation technologies in the way that it can have the tendency to de-skill and atomize workers, and therefore drive down wages and drive up their precarity. And we see that particularly in the gig economy, but we're increasingly seeing in other different places. We see it in journalism, we see it in education increasingly with the automation of the production of lesson plans or marking, which leaves open to question the continued role of the teacher and the impacts on pedagogy. We see it in financial services and all different sorts of contexts. And each of those different contexts throw up different political, ethical, work-related or regulatory questions. So AI is not one thing, it's a different type of technology that applies to different contexts and therefore requires different responses and actions. And I feel like that kind of like breaking that down helps us to construct a response that is politically and practically feasible and credible. Because for all of the critique that we might have about like big tech or technology or AI, whatever, part of the project, and I understand part of the Forum 2029 project, is to build something that is both ambitious but also credible and feasible. And so in identifying how AI or other related technologies intersect with different types of workers and different contexts, it also identifies crucially how we can start to organize and engage different people and different constituencies around it. Like it's a different scenario for teachers than it is for Amazon workers in warehouses, and it is for Amazon workers who are doing the computer programming in the head office. And those are different constituencies that need to be activated around this issue and the way that it threatens their livelihood, but also other ethical or political concerns that they might have. And then that gives us the sort of foundational basis, like we talk a lot about building power, what does that actually look like, of driving the changes that we want to see, that we might want to see in 2029, before that or after that. So what might those be? One of the things I think is that we need like a package of interventions. Some of them are related to AI and some of them are really long-standing or have been resurfaced and need to be re-excavated for this particular moment. The first of all, and I'll say this as a representative of the TUC, is just the fundamental thing about like collective bargaining. Like that is something that is maybe a bit tired to say, but like the fundamental relationship of power imbalance within the workplace is exaggerated by AI technologies because it de-skills and it atomizes and it rationalizes the tasks that workers do, which grants more power to employers generally. That was the same in the Industrial Revolution. It's the same now with automation technologies, whether they're surveillance or task automation technologies. The second is obviously, the second part of that is, and that's about gaining a fair share. And that applies to now, and that applies to the way that AI might concentrate or tend to concentrate power and wealth and the ability to command power and wealth within the economy. Next bit is rights at work. Fundamentally, we need an extension of the rights at work, and actually the Employment Rights Bill does go some way to addressing some of the historic issues. And we'd like to see that go further in certain cases, and particularly around technology in terms of transparency and explainability and contestability where that's used. We also want to see the reciprocity of data access. Sounds very technical and boring, but it's actually very practically grounded. So if you think about Uber drivers, Uber drivers are algorithmic, their pay is algorithmically determined based on demand and supply, which means when they go into work in a day, they don't know what they're going to make, because each job might be determined based on things that are outside of their control. And there's evidence that Uber understands the profile of that driver, whether they're in debt, whether they've just made repairs to their car, whether there's something else going on individually or within their kind of like group of profiled people that will make them accept lower prices for the ride that they're being offered by the app. But this is not new. This is the sort of like fundamentals of gig work and piecework, you know, that they were doing on the London docks like 150 years ago as well, but now mediated through technology. And what we want is the access to that data that Uber creates, that the drivers create, but the Uber takes, and the drivers aren't able to access it and therefore able to contest it. So there's like fundamental technical barriers or legal barriers that we need to change. The next part is the role of the firm. So we know that there's a phenomena in this country where firms have the primacy of shareholders and shareholder interests, and particularly those who are floated on the stock market. What shareholder interests mean is that they're remote, often they're distant from the company, they're not particularly interested in the well-being or development or innovation of the company, and they are interested in the returns on a quarterly or semi-annually or annual basis. And that means when it comes to AI, the incentive for employers is to drive down costs, to cut headcount, and rather than take the productivity gains that might be generated from AI, and they are yet to materialize, but there is a possibility that they do, and reinvest them into the workforce in wages or actually innovative production, instead of just skimming that off the top and spiriting it away. What that looks like, again, is another dry thing, but we are at a policy event, is corporate governance reform. More politically interesting, that's basically about like democratization of the company, where you're putting workers and other perhaps stakeholders in control of, or having a modicum of control or participation in the direction of the company, so that it's not just about short-term shareholders that are being looked after, but it's also about workers who are able to participate in deciding technology strategies or investment strategies or lines of business that might be developed. And these, again, are the old sort of demands of industrial democracy that actually need, that I think deserve renewed prominence at this time. next point is public money for public goods. Over the past 3 years, UK government quango called the UK Research and Innovation Agency spent £23 billion of taxpayer money on research and development on AI and all sorts of other technologies, some of which are actually really useful and good, including like life sciences and stuff. But that money often is going to universities and is going to private sector companies. The trade unions and organized workers do not have basically any purchase on that. And a lot of that is going to drive technologies that eventually end up in the workplace, potentially displacing or degrading the quality of people's work. So from a kind of like clear practical demand perspective, we're arguing that workers should have participation in the research agendas that are set by these organizations that are spending public money, participate in the development of technologies that is helping workers to improve their jobs or to have more time off or to develop their skills, whatever it might be. Similarly with public procurement, which is actually most of the way how big tech finds its way into government. Big tech, Microsoft, Google, all of the companies that you know and all of the companies that you don't have contracts with the government through processes of procurement. That's tens of billions of pounds of public money every year that doesn't come with real conditionalities on building the public sector's capacity to do that work themselves. So it's the outsourcing crisis stuff again, but around technology, or to actually have respect for the rights of workers or even for the citizens that those services will eventually be delivered. The final part of the package, is this really uncertain question about skills, social security, and taxation if there is major disruption to jobs and the labor market caused through AI. We've all heard the stories or the speculation about mass displacement of work and like what that would mean. I don't know if that's going to happen. I don't think anybody knows that's what's going to happen, but there is a duty on the labor movement, on government, on others who are interested in that to anticipate and plan for different scenarios of where that happens, because otherwise there's the potential, there's an outside chance that we have a phenomena of what was experienced in the 80s in industrial communities through digital AI, digitalization and AI-led displacement. This time, more likely, it's going to be in white-collar professions. But if a large amount of people can't get work or can't get good work, then that is not going to be good for the politics of our country. And we've already seen that in post-industrial communities and the way that reform is preying on insecurity and precarity there. So finally, to wrap up, the basic fundamentals of the argument I'm making is that there's a golden thread here, and that's worker voice and concerns that give direction to technology and the development of technology, regulation, spending, taxation, procurement, whatever it might be. Whereas at the moment, the orientation is just to accelerate technology. There is not a direction that is sufficient or a purpose even, it's just growth unbridled. And the movement needs to go, labor movement, in my view, needs to go beyond asking for protections in the workplace only, although that is important, or a better slice of the pie, because AI actually threatens the ability for workers to command a slice of the pie if they do not have bargaining power because their skills are degraded or there's mass unemployment. And so part of that means demanding in the sort of, then there is a tradition of this within the left that is not super prominent, but demanding a say over the direction and purpose of socially useful innovation and technology. And I think that is something that is a positive agenda that we do need to step into. I know positive agendas are hard. They are hard for the left because we're used to critiquing, but we do need to step into that positive agenda and offer something that is different and an alternative to what is currently being offered by Silicon Valley, who are in the meeting rooms with decision makers at the moment. So one policy, Will, because I'll wrap up, is I'll go back to that thing, which I don't know how much it plays on the doorstep, to be honest, but is about taking that 23 billion and the 22 billion that the Chancellor's just promised for R&D investment in AI technologies and making sure that that comes with conditions to inform the development of good work that is accessible to all. And maybe public money with strings attached is actually something that can work on the doorstep. Thank you.
Thanks, Adam. Yes, very much the right place for positive agendas here. And I think when as you were speaking, it reminded me that when we're making the case or we're talking about what the policy arguments are for things like the shorter working week, we often draw on, of course, the rich history of effectively the labour movement pivoting off mechanization, pivoting off productivity enhancing technologies and saying, well, actually, if you're getting better margins and pumping out more widgets, we need to have, kind of see some of the benefits of that too. So we actually do have a session on work, tax and incomes in September. So if you're interested in continuing that conversation, which is actually quite a nice segue as the final speaker on this panel, summer recess, and then we re-enter on the work conversation. That's quite nice. Okay, I'm going to open up to questions. There's just two things I wanted to kind of cover real quick. One was something Natalie mentioned, and I suppose just with my autonomy hat on, we do work on political donations quite a lot. We have an ongoing project on that, funded by the JRT. And it's just a point you mentioned, Natalie, around, it's worth reiterating that politicians in this country are relatively cheap compared to other countries. Like, in America, compared to America, for example, Simon Krupa's book, Good Chaps, I don't know if that's a very, very thin, but very illuminating book around, the price of politicians in terms of their donations they receive and so on. And he points out at some point, somewhere between, you can just throw down somewhere between 20 and 50K and get a dinner with the Prime Minister, which to an oligarch is nothing. It's like absolutely nothing, but you can be in the room with and court the Prime Minister of this country for peanuts for an oligarch, for example. So there needs to be a conversation around political donations, whether it's capping them, how do we find a way of getting around a super PAC system? All these kind of conversations need to happen. And I think there's lots of good groups, Spotlight on Corruption, Transparency International, we're doing our bit and so on. But that's definitely part of the democracy conversation, because in this country, politicians are really cheap. And then the other thing, actually, Lena, I wouldn't mind, what's the specific policy that you would be advocating for? Because you were kind of circling the...
Yeah, it's just proportional representation.
Proportional representation. Okay, with that, you've heard enough from us. I think it's been a great panel, and let's give them all a round of applause.